This is The Common Denominator, and I'm Ilana Rachel Daniel. Welcome back to The Common Denominator. I'm Ilana Rachel Daniel. Those chaotic sounds are not, this time, coming out from Israel, but from that which has dominated the news for nearly 2 weeks, the chaos on U.S. university campuses. I, along with the rest of the world, have been watching events unfold. We hear the chants and the shouts. We see the unironic, smug, embarrassing conviction of the student protesters, assured of their self-righteousness, even as visibly Jewish kids are physically blocked and bullied in their attempts to move across campus. Lo and behold, the capacity of disgust runs deep, and I am appalled. I am incensed. In Israel, where half of the world's 15 million Jews live, we face daily the potential for life-threatening terrorism and war. But it's in the US where the vast majority of Diaspora Jews live and have thrived in its bastion of freedom. And with it, Jews have contributed the best of our brilliance and innovation, and together we have grown. We, America and the West, are at a turning point. I think it's fair to conclude that we might each see it thus. While the threat is now and most urgently upon the life and limb, the continuity of the entirety of the Jewish people, once again, I do not believe it eludes the consciousness of a single one whose mind has not been hijacked, that the West itself is that which is under attack. We realize with the start our mortality and how fragile was the endeavor after all. Jew hate is a symptom. Oh, it's very real to us Jews, but is a symptom all the same of infection, of rot and disease in a society. It has always been, and is so today. But even here in Israel, we bite our nails for the US because it was the US who promised to do better, and we believed them, and they did so for a time. Watching an uprising in the name of those who live-streamed the most atrocious crimes humans have ever committed and swear to repeat on ever greater scale happen on elite university lawns, the height of affluence and privilege and future bright. It pulls at the roots of what has made America great: freedom of speech and thought and religion, informed consent, self-determination, individual expression, education, of becoming. How did we get here? I saw this quote, and it does a fantastic job of describing the phenomenon that we all see. David Wolpe said this, and I quote, "Anti-Semitism is a protean. Whatever you hate, you can transfer to the Jew. Today, colonial settlerism is the evil of choice, so Jews are colonial settlers. Nazism is a perennial hate, so Jews are Nazis. If you hate communism, Jews are communists. If you hate capitalism, Jews are capitalists. You can hate Jews because they are weak and stateless, or because they are strong and ethno-nationalists, because they wear regular clothes and blend in, or because they wear long black coats and side curls and refuse to assimilate, because they are subhuman, the Nazis called them vermin, and because they are superhumans who control the world, because they are resolutely secular or stubbornly religious, because they went like lambs to the slaughter, or because they fight too vigorously. The image of the Jew shape-shifts as a dark psychic threat in the hater's mind. The one thing the anti-Semite is sure of, however, whether marching at a Klan rally or just hanging out on campus, there is a good reason. They would never hate Jews just because they are Jews." Unquote. The university protests are synchronized. The formation, the matching tents, the accessories believe its origins. Far from the organic grassroots movements we're asked to imagine sprung up, bursting from the chest of trust fund children on the injustices in Palestine. And Palestine, that place, both place and genocide, unlike any before or since, primarily because it consists of each individual's varied and most aspirational fantasies, and thus cannot be contradicted. So enmeshed is it in storytelling, ignorance, and emptiness all at once. We know that there are more than students on those hallowed grounds. Faculty, for one, and paid protesters setting up camp and mingling within. The real people of this fabricated and manipulated forever conflict are of little interest at all in lieu of the stories, so very many stories told about us. It is our tragedy, the people in Gaza and those of us in Israel, that we've been made into the most lucrative brand going. Each of our suffering is deliberate and prolonged, and we begin to discover only now, and for what purpose. It helps the industrial military complex move inventory, no doubt, but that purpose too, as it looks from here, is the destruction of Western civilization from within. And we have arrived, people. Theirs has been a long game, and the dividends have paid off in spades. Our world is changing. Our world has changed. The question only remains, will we be those to wrestle the future in the direction of light and hope, or will our future be plunged into terrible totalitarian rule? And if you don't catch my meaning, it's this. The most prosperous nations are at this moment in a free fall. They're crumbling from within. It's become, unfortunately, unavoidable, and thus undeniable. And it's being aided in no small part by the brilliant and diabolical technology and innovation that has studied and mastered the other most lucrative business in the world, that of capturing your mind and your attention. Your attention for all manner of sales, of products which you don't need and wouldn't otherwise be drawn to consume, to ideas that manipulate, dumb down, and sway. A fully packaged revolution to bring down the free world, all at your fingertips and without a shot fired. If ill-intended forces have succeeded this far, covertly, then should they come to outright power, can you now begin to imagine the inescapable control grid of mind and body and soul that they have access to utilize? It would be one we cannot escape for many long generations to come. Eyal Yakoby, a senior at the University of Pennsylvania, is a dual major in political science and modern Middle East studies. His leadership has thrust him into the forefront of discussions on the pressing challenges of escalating radicalism and anti-Semitism within university environments. Yakoby's impactful insights have extended to the halls of Capitol Hill, where he addressed these critical issues in front of the Congress. Yakoby's voice has reached a vast audience, appearing over 20 times on prominent television networks such as CNN, ABC, Sky News, Fox, CBS, News Nation, and Newsmax, just to name a few. His contributions extend to written publications as well. He's authored, published, and been featured in major publications such as the Washington Post, the New York Post, the Free Press, Bloomberg, and Forbes, among others. And now he joins us here on the Common Denominator. Eyal, welcome. It's great to have you here.
It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Eyal, I really want to give you the rest of the floor to tell your tale, to tell what you've seen. Let's start, I guess, from when things started for you at Penn. How long have you been there?
I'm a senior, so I'm out the door.
Okay. Okay, well, I see that the Middle East came to you, according to your studies, so you got a head start on there. But tell us, how did you find yourself in the role of spokesperson for the chaos that's happening there? And when, even though we have just sort of tuned in earnest in the past couple weeks, when did the protests actually begin? Because you were already speaking in Congress in December.
Definitely. So thank you for the question. I have never been an activist. I still would not describe myself as an activist. Penn hosted the Palestine Reds Literature Festival back in September of 2023, which was a festival that was publicly, I guess, described as a literature festival, but in reality, it featured prominent anti-Semites such as Roger Waters, Mark Lamont Hill, Ayaganame, Rafat Al-Arir, so some big names in the anti-Semitic world. And this is prior to October 7th. And as a dual citizen of Israel with family in Israel, it bothered me to my core to have, not only what I viewed as a lie in terms of it being a literature festival, but also inviting these anti-Semites into my community, my university. And prior to this, I was rarely seen at Hillel, Chabad, fairly uninvolved in Jewish life. And since then, it's really just thrust me at the forefront of fighting this battle. And literally on October 7th, I had a Zoom meeting scheduled, still discussing how to deal with the Palestine Rights Literature Festival. And so after October 7th, obviously everything kind of, blew up in terms of the anti-Semitism that we were witnessing on campus.
So what first started happening in campus in October?
Definitely. So I guess this probably will tie into potentially a different topic that we'll talk about a little bit further on. But there were protests happening on October 8th, and what I find interesting is this whole notion of free speech and the right to protest. These encampments that we're witnessing right now are acting as though their right to protest has been stripped away from the government, when in reality, at least at Penn, we can track at least 30 protests since October 7th prior to the encampment. So it seems like there has been no restriction on your ability to protest. It's really just when you break the law, then people have a problem with it.
Absolutely. I mean, there is no question that free speech is the foundation for a free society. 100%. We've seen it in action. Need look no further than China, Russia, any of these other places. Free speech is enshrined exactly for the speech that we don't want to hear, that we don't like, that's offensive and stupid and gross and has no place in the civilized world. Where that draws the line, of course, what we see, I mean, some of the scenes coming out of those campuses are, like I said, I have personally been sitting under terrorists roaming the streets and missile fire from Iran, and I'm utterly outraged at watching the physical blocking of a guy with side locks and a hat, a clearly Jewish-looking guy to try and make his way across the street. It is shocking. It's appalling. Saying nasty, horrible things is nasty and horrible, but we're not talking about free speech. We're already crossed into the blocking the movement. We're blocking again in a world where America has come, where you can't call a man in a skirt a man, right? Because that's called hate speech. That's called violent. He feels unsafe, right? We're supposed to all go along with certain fantasies as reality. To outright call for the annihilation of the entire Jewish people, certainly the entirety of Israel. I don't hear anybody cheering for a two-state solution. And that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about blocking people's fundamental rights. And it's happening on college campuses. It's happening in front of God and everyone. And it's happening with a really hefty tuition bill, I must say. It's sort of this guarantee, like we all paid to get into this ride. How are you telling me I can't get in? So this whole idea of blocking this free speech sort of goes into the sort of, play that everyone's watching, sort of scoffing. I mean, appalled, but really people are scoffing at a lot of these protesters who have never known a moment's adversity, setting up camp and getting Uber Eats to bring in breakfast and whatnot. So, I saw a scene this morning, and they had taken down the American flag at the University of North Carolina and rung up the Palestinian flag. And I got to tell you, it's not good. It's really shocking, I have to say.
Yeah, and the same thing actually happened at CUNY, the City University of New York, just a few blocks away from Columbia. And the police just cleared out the protesters last night, and you can see the cops, African-American cops, who mind you, in their chants, they're saying NYPD, KKK, IDF, they're all the same. So comparing the NYPD to the KKK. And I just think it's such a beautiful image when you see the Black police officers raising the American flag once again, and it shows what America stands for. And I think you brought up another interesting point about, this new pronouns of calling people by their preferred pronouns. And I think it's as simple as this. I have no problem with calling someone by their preferred pronouns. I have no problem with it. If it offends them, if I don't, then in my mind, it's why would I not just save someone else, their feelings hurt or their identity being threatened. What bothers me though is when that's not reciprocated by everyone. And so we're seeing double standards emerge very quickly. And what I think they're not recognizing is that they're setting very bad precedents for themselves, because what we've seen over the past decade at Penn as well is we've seen speech limited on the grounds that it's offensive time in and time out. And what's going to happen after this is people who are radicals on the other side are then going to do the exact same thing. And when these protesters then say, like, we don't want that, that's hate speech, they're going to say, look what you did. You said this was okay. And so I think what's starting to emerge is the boy who cried wolf to an extent. And I think in the end, it's really going to, it's going to shoot them in the back in terms of their movement and what they're saying. And I think overall, it's also potentially you could say that it was free speech before, but at this point, it's definitely not about speech whatsoever. It's about physical violence. And I think on even the grounds of free speech, the U.S. government limits free speech all the time. In the same way that you can't yell bomb in a crowded movie theater, well, that's just speech, right? But because it puts people's lives at risk, then you can't scream it. Likewise, for instance, at Penn, we had people chanting Al-Qassam, make us proud, take another soldier down. At Princeton, they were waving the Hezbollah flag. At Columbia, they were chanting death to America. At all these universities, they're chanting Intifada. And when I go on American news channels now, a big thing that I hone in on is that this chant, Intifada, was something that we were talking about back in October when they were chanting this, saying that this is incitement to violence. It's calling for an uprising to happen. And I always conclude saying what you're witnessing at Columbia University is an intifada. That is what a globalized intifada looks like. It's taking over a building. It's shattering glasses. In their own words, they took 3 janitors, quote, hostage in the building. And so when we were saying intifada means this, and people were trying to act like, well, there's nuance to it. There's no nuance. At Columbia University, anyone in the world should look at that and realize that that is what a modern and global intifada looks like.
I actually think it's a really interesting point that you bring up, Eyal, because ask anybody in Israel what we know about an intifada. Intifada means to us hopping on a bus and not knowing if it's going to explode. It means for us hearing a big boom and waiting a few seconds to hear how many police cars you hear, whether it was something falling from a construction site or something you need to start calling loved ones about. So we know exactly what intifada means, but what you're describing actually is very interesting. It's the normalization of violence, which is essentially sort of these early stages of what we're already experiencing here. I think you're 100% correct. This whole idea of everything in the name of resistance, all things are permitted, even though there have been many people who have been displaced, there have been many refugees, there have been many changing of lines and territory since man could draw a line in the sand. But these are the only group of people permitted to do the most atrocious things, and we're supposed to say, how could they not? We infantilize the entirety of the Arab population in the West Bank and Gaza as if what could we expect, which I think is a horrendous injustice to them as well. And I've seen many posts going around as well, of this idea of the oppressor being the white man, and the falseness of it, which exactly like you said, what happening with the New York PD. And also here, we have so much, I mean, we have an entire range of colors here. A vast majority of the population in Israel is from Mizrahi countries. What I want to say about that specifically, what it reminds me of is, especially with a conversation I had last week with a woman who was born in Iran, is really what we're seeing is the minorities, as it were, the people who came to America seeking refuge, or the people who already lived in the West and have enjoyed it or understood it because they're part of some sort of minority, are the ones who are absolutely now standing up and pointing to what they see and trying to save it, of trying to wake the rest of us up, and also literally going there on the front lines and trying to protect the freedom that we all have enjoyed, the freedom that gives these people the ability to sit on a manicured lawn and munch snacks and talk about an uprising that they have no idea, no idea you have in Israel. You have if you want to just do the whole simplified of oppressed and oppressor, I mean, you get it all with the Jews, the forever minority, indigenous people, 3,500 years of proof. I mean, you get so much, and yet that's the power of the manipulation that has been over many decades, which I want to touch on later, of how we got to this. One of the best pictures that I saw was was of a young woman sitting with a guitar in front of a Hezbollah flag or something laid out in front of her. It was a sort of laughable inversion of sort of Vietnam War protests. So how did you come to address Congress? What were you recognizing happening in Penn that got you to that stage?
Yeah, so just backtracking on, I guess my story is after October 7th, first thing I did was call my dad. He's Israeli, served in the IDF, and literally just I cried a lot that morning, and not only just out of horror by the images and videos emerging, but also just out of guilt that, I'm, like you said, we're very privileged to live here. I'm very privileged to go to Penn, and the guilt of sitting in my dorm room and not having literally any ability to save any of the hostages or bring people to the hospital or just clear out the Kfarim in the southwestern Negev. And my dad, Israeli, said very bluntly, look, you have two options. You either, hop on a plane and start training, or you do everything you can from the United States. And what I realized was that it's just as important to have people in the diaspora as it is in Israel. And I said this to NI12 back in the fall on Israeli station. Yesh milchama betoch habayit v'michutz lo. And I believe that. And there's a war being waged both within Israel, but outside of Israel too. And the only way to show people exactly what we're fighting for is by explaining it to them. And a big thing I realized is that the way that Israel advocacy has worked for so long is it discusses Israel in absolutist terms, which then subsequently leads to these long-winded, complicated answers talking about the Peel Commission and the Balfour Declaration and 1947 partition plan and the war of attrition and the Six-Day War, but how the Oslo Accords didn't work because of the Palestinians, and then you have the Camp David Accords. No one wants to hear that. No one has the patience to hear and explain all of that. And it's, first of all, amazing to know all that stuff because it's very, very interesting history. But when you're having a conversation or just trying to give sound bites to people, especially in the age of internet, when my generation, through psychological studies, we know that we have a short attention span. you can't just force feed these historical facts and then expect people to regurgitate them and agree with you. And so what I realized was that you literally just have to simplify everything down. And I mean, suffice to say, I literally, AOC tweeted in defense of the Colombia protesters, and I just retweeted her and said, this must be satire. And I got one of the most likes on my post possible. And I didn't give any long-winded answer. I just exposed her for being comical in her level of critical thinking when it comes to the subject. And so I think there needs to be kind of a reawakening of the pro-Israel advocacy movement, because clearly what we're doing isn't working. And I just want to touch upon your privileged college students holding the Hezbollah flag. Is privilege is interesting, especially in the United States with critical race theory and DEI. So there's different subsections to privilege, and there's levels to it. So for instance, a white person compared to a black person, the white person is the privileged, the black person is the underprivileged in the eyes of critical race theory. But then you have wealth disparity. So then that can make it complicated. What if the black person is more wealthy than the white person? Okay, well, then that complicates it. But now let's say the black person and the white person, one has, has higher education, and one is not fortunate enough to have higher education. And so the privilege levels work differently. But I think everyone can agree that attending an Ivy League university, whether you're wealthy or not, is still a huge privilege in your life, just based on statistics in terms of job opportunities, in terms of the opportunities and resources that you offer financial aid at the university, the food plan, the professor access, everything possible, even healthcare plans that the university can offer you. And so what I find amusing, to say the least, is that we don't see these encampments happening in public parks, for instance, where the least privileged go. We're seeing them happening in the gates, the literal gates of Columbia University, one of the formerly most esteemed university in the United States and the world. And so I think it's an interesting idea and concept to look at why are these encampments happening only at universities and not, let's say, in a public park. Because at a public park, you do have the First Amendment. You can chant basically whatever you want, as long as it doesn't directly lead to violence. But at universities, these are public property, and they do have the ability to limit your speech. Just like in a private neighborhood, let's say, you can't just start yelling on a bullhorn at 2 a.m., waking everyone up, right? That's a noise complaint, but it's speech at the same time. And what I think it exposed to everyone in the world is the lack of courage and leadership that has been transpiring at these institutions for decades now. And I think it's very sad to see what's happening. It's also important to look at the silver lining that if this didn't happen now, in 5 years from now, we may have been too far gone to even fix what's been broken.
There's a lot of really interesting things to unpack there. First, I want to note something about laying on the idea of privilege. I don't think that it's a crime to be privileged or something that should be inherently scoffed at. I think that what you're talking about is really sort of the microcosm of what we see in the West, in particular in America. The privilege of going to a school such as UPenn and all the other, if you're aware of the privilege, the difference being is understanding the value of the opportunity that you have and utilizing it to the most. That's a beautiful thing to do with that moment of privilege, that opportunity that you have. So there's nothing inherently embarrassing or somehow more noble to be poor or a business class, or a working class person. All of these things are, none of these things are inherent. So I want to say that to be able to go. What?
Just a brief point on that. I saw this article, which I thought was brilliant. It's basically saying that a very rich man who is sad and a very poor man who is very happy, who has more privilege in life. And I think it's just a very powerful quote about like what's important in life is we're making these arbitrary lines being drawn that money equates privilege, but in I would say the majority of the world's eyes, happiness is privilege. And I think it's just an important reminder to everyone in the world.
Well, I think it's a matter of it's dumbing things down, just like it's all old white men. I mean, these are these black and white dumbed down trenches that nobody really fits into. Yeah, people are complex. We're made of different experiences in different time and place. And it's a wonderful thing to go and try to better your mind. It's a wonderful thing to try to achieve something with the moments that you had it, and I the opportunities that you've had. I want to say something again about the idea of being a diaspora Jew working. I was really moved by what you were describing, your conversation with your father, and I completely agree and root for both hands this advocacy. Exactly like the conclusion you came to, Eyal. There are battles taking place on several fronts. There's the one down the road, the very physical one, the very terrifying one, but a battle of truth. And I'm talking about not my truth and not yours, but there's shared reality. We share reality. There's biology, there's gravity, there's events that happen to the Jews, for instance, collectively, and we can access them. And standing there, proud and spine strong in clear language, exactly as you said, and we're not going all the way back to days of partition and all of that, because it does get complicated, is more than necessary. It's 100% part of fighting this battle. You know, in early days, I actually wasn't on Twitter at all. Not a big fan, but I started watching to sort of see where the tide was going after the attack. And I watched this unhinged dialogue increase each day. It sort of began to take its own life of its own, and each day you'd wake up to a new libel, a new dressed up libel of the day, and I kept wondering, do people realize what's happening here? Do people watching how there would be a sort of a news flash of something happening to Jews, then it was quickly usurped and copy pasted onto, its exact inverse narrative. And I wondered if anybody was paying attention, if anybody was watching. And I thought to myself, who is funding this? I want to get to it in a second. Isabella Tabarovsky, who did a bunch of work on the Soviet Union's role in establishing anti-Zionism as ki'ilu, as if a substitute, meaning its real use is a substitute of being anti-Jewish, and everybody knows it. We all just had Passover Seder. What do you say at the very end? Shana Ban Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem. It is inherent. The Jewish people can no more be separated from the Torah and the land of Israel than we can be from any of our limbs. It's part and parcel of who we are. So this idea of creating it as if it was this other, as if it was this sort of identity that we had to sign up for, actually takes root from the Soviet Union. Soviet Union's now defunct, but that lives on. So anyway, I was saying that online, I really wondered who was behind this degree. I would go into one, in early days, you would go into one person's comment and then you would just be bombarded with horrific images, certainly plenty of them AI, but also some of them real, that you couldn't help but have a visceral reaction to. You cannot be confronted with such gore and not have a visceral reaction to it. And I watched the establishment of this narrative, the complete false inverse narrative. So being out there and speaking truth to power with pride in who you are, and clarity that's an act of resistance. That's an act of defiance, and that's an act of resilience. And I can tell you that I don't know all these Jews in the world, and there's nobody, I don't know why we don't have better advocacy, better hasbara for truths that are so really seemingly kind of obvious and objective for Israel. But anyway, the job's open if you're looking. So also, Eyal, let's talk about Anne Gordon. You really got on her skin.
I mean, I don't think there's that much to talk about in terms of Professor Norton. I fully have just been screenshotting her own Twitter, which is public, posting it on my Twitter, and putting the caption, "Does this seem appropriate from a UPenn professor?" And then she tweeted yesterday those awful, awful accusations about me, which are completely unfounded, obviously, untrue, borderline libelous, and it was disgusting to wake up to. And I just started posting on Twitter like a couple weeks ago, if that, maybe a week and a half ago. And I've obviously accrued a good following in that short amount of time. And it was just nice to see like enough people are logical enough to see how just evil that accusation was. I mean, that was one of the worst accusations possible to throw at someone.
What
And
did
I think
she accuse you of, Eyal?
she accused me of leading a campaign against her that called for her rape and death.
Oh my goodness.
And anyone is welcome to go on my Twitter and look at what I posted about her. It was her own words. And that's basically it. Yeah. I guess there's a former Supreme Court justice who posted, I'm definitely butchering and paraphrasing this quote, but the light of day will reveal the truth for anything. And I think that's what it kind of exposed is she feels comfortable posting these horrible remarks when she thinks no one's listening. Guess
Right.
what? I'm listening. Right. And when the, camera was put on her, all of a sudden she became embarrassed by what she was saying and then started, I guess, getting flustered and just, I mean, as a professor, you have to carry yourself with a little bit more dignity, in my opinion. And I think that's what's happened. I think people don't like being exposed for being anti-Semites, but at the same time, you have to expose them. And in terms of, Twitter and the amount of anti-Semitism and that being thrown, I don't see that much validity to it, just because number one, it's an international platform, and we know that in the world, the majority of the world hates Jews, like actually will say that they hate Jews. And so it doesn't bother me that much when I see some random person based in Pakistan or Iran or Lebanon that is tweeting awful things about the Jews. I dismiss it. What bothers me is when you have someone who's the former head of the political science department at the University of Pennsylvania who's tweeting these things, because it not only is her that is an anti-Semite, but it's also every student that she's ever had she could have corrupted and said these comments in class. And so that's where the crux, I think, of what's happening leads to, is the professors themselves. And you'll see in about 15 minutes when I expose it, but Ann Norton is also on the faculty senate, which was tasked with whether or not the encampment should remain or leave. Does anyone think that she's unbiased enough to decide whether the encampment should stay or go? And so it's just, honestly, it's just ludicrous, the level that anti-Semitism and craziness, I guess, has just taken root at these universities.
I think that's one of the things that we most need to talk about in moving forward is how we got here. And I think that academia has a lot to answer for. I think, again, what I know from the sort of production of anti-Zionist was paid for by the Soviet Union, paid a professor for a paper and paid another professor, meaning paid each professor for each publication until they were quoting each other. And before long, you sort of had an entire course curriculum built out of it. And I think that it's exactly true. If what she's tweeting online, we can only imagine what's being said in the privacy of a classroom. And I think that what they've been pumping out has absolutely undermined Western democracy, and no less.
100%. And I talk about this. I've been talking about this as well, that back to the students and how they're, the girl playing the guitar with the Hezbollah flag in front of her is, to an extent, you have to feel bad for these students. And I say that, and take it, please, with a grain of salt. But think about, if you had not known anything about Israel other than being some country where Jews live in the Middle East, you enter college, the first class you take at Columbia to learn about it is taught by a professor who said on October 7th how amazing and fantastic it was. You take this course with him for one semester. What do you think about Israel? I mean, do you seriously put all the blame on the student, or do you put the blame on the professor and say that you have totally just brainwashed and indoctrinated the student? And what I mean specifically about them being the victim is, when the dust settles, like it just did last night at Columbia, that professor isn't going to be the one behind bars or with a criminal record. It's the student who is an 18-year-old who is going to be behind bars. And to an extent, I feel bad, or they've been manipulated and told that they're self-righteous and that this will end up being positive, when in reality, Columbia University has no boots on the ground in Gaza. They have no ability to stop the invasion of Rafah. So it has no end goal for stopping what they describe as the occupation. The only thing that it's accomplishing is, number one, ruining the branding of Columbia University and all these other universities, and getting these students criminal records, suspension records, even expulsion. And I think, you got to have a little bit of empathy for these students who have been lied to and kind of coerced to break the law.
It's and with all due respect, that's the very definition of useful idiot. I'm sure that we have a mixture of everything, like in all places, people who intend for good and are, drawn off track, and the people who really are looking for some trouble. And either way, they find it. I think that a lot of these kids have been told obviously they've been told an inversion of the truth. And I think that it so permeates every pore of the media, barring some simple curiosity and maybe a Google search, there would be no indication to seek a different narrative. Although
I'll tell you exactly on this topic. I'll tell you a quick story that I was talking to one of the I don't even know how to describe. I can't call them protesters because they're not protesting anything, but the campers, let's say at Penn, and he was telling me how he's Jewish, and I said to him, I was totally blunt. I said, I don't think you're Jewish. I don't care. He was fully wrapped in a keffiyeh. I said, I don't think you're a Jew. And he said, I'm Jewish. And I asked him, what's today in terms of, he goes, Passover. I go, but what specifically is today? And he didn't know it was Yom Tov. And I'm secular, so that's something that also is a little bit far reaching for me. But he insisted that he was Jewish. And I said, just because you're Jewish doesn't mean you can't be an anti-Semite. For instance, Jews worked with Hitler during the final solution. And he goes, yes, the Yehud. And I go, no, Capo. And he goes, the Yehud. And I go, I don't know what history textbook you're reading. The Yehud were talking to Nazis at the start of the war to try to make Jews leave. But Hitler himself was going to invade the British Mandate of Palestine. So it doesn't make sense. And so I say, and he said, well, look at the documentation. And I go, one letter sent by one random member of the Yehud to a random Nazi does not classify as this mass conspiracy theory to help Hitler with the final solution. And so that's what I say, is that it's a total inversion of the truth. You have, if there was an ocean of truth, they grasp the drop of water that has an iota of merit and spin it to then infect the rest of the ocean. And that's what's been happening story after story when I talk to these people, is there's one single story, just like, they talk about the Camp David Accords and the Oslo Accords and say that it's on the Israelis that they failed because of one telegraph that was sent where some random US politician said the Israelis don't want to compromise on this. And then they take that and they totally neglect every other record that's present, and that's what they cling on to.
That's exactly, I've described that exact phenomenon, which is they take this thread that's of technical fact. Okay, we've got one, but they weave it with a framework that's utterly false to really literally come up with a fantasy, with an absolute fantasy, which again, I also have the empathy and I also have the frustration at the lack of curiosity, because at some point the hypocrisies, they run out. I want to ask you, have you run into other professors? Certainly we all know of Shai Davidai, God bless him, he is fighting the good fight. Are there other professors who are pro-Israel, pro-civilization that you see at UPenn or other places who have been speaking out?
Yes, and I want to toe the line here, because what I've realized is that when you play the game and the other side isn't playing by the rules, they're playing by a different game. They're playing a different game completely. And so that's what frustrates me, is it's the professors that are pro-Israel that still want to go to the classroom and actually teach, not live out in a tent all day. And they're following university guidelines. So for instance, at Penn, we have professors that are actually in the encampments themselves supporting the students. Well, how are those professors directly violating university policy and still employed? And so whereas the professors that are pro-Israel wants to continue researching, these other professors, in their minds, they have nothing to lose at the end of the day. We do have professors out there protesting with us, but that's when we, for instance, get a permit to have a rally that's 1 hour long, and then we disperse. For instance, Shai Davidai, right? He's now put on investigation, as his ID access is denied, and the pro-Israel professors, I mean this in like the most like true sense possible, not to be disrespectful to these other professors. They have lives and they have research that they're very interested in and want to pursue, and they don't want to get what happened to Shai Davidai. And Shai Davidai just has a different perspective because he's Israeli, whereas Jewish professors, as outspoken as they are, just have it. The reality is that they just have a different perspective, and it's important to recognize the amount of pressure that's being put on these professors, because at the end of the day, they're agents of the university. They're first and foremost being paid to represent the university. And so there's plenty of professors very much behind the scenes, and there's definitely professors who are also, leading campaigns. You just might not see them on the news because they want to protect their own career and their own research.
I see what you're saying. Because it also puts them in a position, on one hand, I don't think anybody gets to sit this one out. And on the other hand, you're talking about do they go outside the rules and confront people on that turf, or do they continue to work within the system? It's not an easy position to be in. I will say that, we are all born into this time. This is a historical period of time for all of us, and we're all here right now, and nobody gets a pass on what they do with this moment. And whatever price we pay for speaking out, for taking risks, which is easier said than done, tomorrow's price is not one that we can afford. So I would say that, I actually really understand, because the truth is, as an Israeli, when you're raised, I was born in the States. I know what that feels like, and I also know what it's like from the Israeli side, just like yourself, really. So I can understand that it may not completely feel like their fight, but I think that's what we're seeing, is that this is all our fight. When they come for the Jews, that is always the symptom that they're coming for freedoms. That's been the historical lesson. We see it now. You talked, Eyal, about not hiding your Jewishness, even though you're a proud secular Jew, but you're a Jew and you're aware of that, and that UPenn has become unrecognizable. Are you experiencing it still as strongly right now? And where do we go from here?
Yeah, so there's a quote in Pirkei Avot, and it's "If not now, when?" And just to touch on what you said, is I think that quote emphasizes that there's no better time than the moment to do something, because that, theoretical better time might never come, and we can't risk that. And I think people in the United States are starting to wake up in terms of the level of hatred and bigotry that's been permeating and festering. And in terms of myself, if I wasn't speaking, then I'd be, in a uniform in Israel. And so if people can put their lives on the line, I can put my voice on the line, no problem. Not ask for any like sympathy or victimhood. I would never want to do that, because people's literal lives are on the line, and it very much could have been me. My parents didn't emigrate to the US. And so that's my message. And I think it could have been, I think a message to all Jews, honestly, is it could have been any Jew had their parents, after the Holocaust, the Shoah, had they gone to Eretz Yisrael instead of the United States or the United Kingdom or France or wherever they dispersed. I mean, there was a 50-50 chance whether they were going to Israel. And so I think just reminding Jews that this is your fight just as much as it's Israel's fight is critical. And tangentially, reminding every freedom-loving country, it's also your fight. For instance, the Houthis, their motto, "Death to Israel, death to America, curse the Jews." It's not just an Israel versus this. Once Israel goes, the West is next. And they openly say this. And I think what Western countries don't understand about the Middle East is appeasement never works. Even there's intra-Arab country or Sunni Shia fighting. Any conflict will tell you there's no such thing as appeasement in the Middle East. And when someone tells you something, you have to believe them because it's true. And I think the West's foreign policy has forgotten that. And I think we need to kind of restore that and really look to the future on how we're going to build. And that's also not to discount. I think the United States and other countries have launched horrible military campaigns in the Middle East, which have resulted in more bloodshed than not. But I do think at the end of the day, we can't just give up on all these countries. And what we're seeing over the past 5 years is the Muslim majority countries who want to be part of the West, who see security and economic advantages to being in an alliance with Israel, are doing that. The key is for the US and other Western allies to continue bridge building between those countries rather than forcing a peace deal, which isn't actually going to be a real one. And I think that's what they have to understand is peace is meaningful when it's true. But if there's not meaningful peace, then it's just going to deteriorate and be worse.
Right. I think that those countries like Saudi, there is this, and particularly with what the attack by Iran a few weeks ago, is surprisingly sort of this new hope, because you only need to be faced with the bad players of terrorism in your home country to understand that it's them or you. And I think that those countries, and not only is my hope sort of in that future, it's actually really, and I say it cliche as it is, seeing people like yourself and some of the youth here in Israel. I mean, you guys are beaming with strength and energy and clarity, and it's awesome. And you're getting a whole big pile of mess to deal with. But yeah, I think that there's no one better for the job. I actually do have a silver lining, because just like it doesn't take that many to sort of ruin the party, It doesn't take that many to make change, and I will forever hold on to that optimism because I still see it. I still see it viable in people like yourself.
Thank you.
So Isabella Tabarovsky, who we noted earlier, she just wrote an article for the Wilson Quarterly, and she said what I think encompassed the theme that we've tried to emphasize here over and over again. She said this: anti-Semitism is not just prejudice, it's also a highly effective political tool, particularly in times of crisis. She goes on to say, and these are all from this same article, which I want to bring here, no one knows that better than people like Putin and Lavrov, who came out of a system that perfected its use as such. It would have been almost astonishing if the Kremlin failed to reach for it at a time when Russia's disastrous war in Ukraine is taking a massive toll on the country. Anti-Semitic incitement related to the Hamas-Israel war is flooding global social media. American university campuses are overcome with protests, and polarization seems to be pulling Western democracies apart at the seams. While China is new to instrumentalizing anti-Semitism, state actors such as Iran and Qatar have been at it for a while. There is no sight dearer to the Kremlin than Western democracies tearing themselves apart over the Israel-Hamas war while anti-Semitism skyrockets. The more they remain focused on these issues, the less bandwidth they will have for Putin's war in Ukraine. She goes on to say, like Russia, Iran seeks to sow chaos and undermine belief in democratic societies. Writing for the Wall Street Journal, executive director of the Middle East Media Research Institute, Stephen Stalinsky, suggests that Iran's terrorist proxies, including Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis, are grooming activists in the US and fomenting anti-Israel and anti-American sentiments at American universities. And for its part, Qatar has drawn recent attention for its massive investments into American higher education. A troubling ISCAP study, the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy, they reported that at least 100 American institutions of higher learning had received $13 billion in undocumented contributions from foreign governments over the last decade. Many of these regimes, it notes, are authoritarian, with Qatar being the largest donor, end quote, from Isabella Tabarovsky's article. So there have been many comments across media and guesses at who has been funding these protests and who has been funding this ongoing onslaught on democracy from within. You have a 2023 report that exposed that Ivy League universities, including Cornell and Harvard, received over $8 billion in the last 35 years from Arab countries. And Qatar gave over $5 billion, Saudi Arabia almost $3 billion, and the state of Palestine had 10 donations totaling $10 million US. Who have you noticed? Who are the protesters? Are they only students? Are they coming from the outside? I've seen plenty of notes of who is funding these protests. And also, I'm curious, where are the lawsuits? We've got wealthy, influential parents, and what are they doing about their kids being blocked from learning?
Definitely. So to address your first question, I would say 80% of the protesters, at least at Penn, thank God I have not visited any of the other encampments. At least 80% are not affiliated with the university whatsoever.
Wow.
They are very clearly paid, like professional protesters. And that, I think, is what's scariest, is when you're a professional protester, it doesn't matter if you get arrested or not, because your job is to protest. If you probably get, a raise if you get arrested. And so that's what's scariest about it. And then in terms of lawsuits, there are lawsuits. I filed litigation around 4 months ago. There's currently lawsuits against Columbia, 2 lawsuits against Columbia, excuse me, 2 against Harvard, 1 against NYU, and then the Department of Education is investigating, I believe, 28 different schools right now, which is a little bit different than lawsuits. But there are definitely pending litigation underway. And especially with these encampments, we're very hopeful that the court will see, how bad these universities have gotten. And from what I've heard, at least at some universities that are experiencing pending litigation, behind closed doors, they're welcoming it because their own bureaucracy is kind of tying their hands to do the things that they want, whereas a lawsuit will force them to do it, and then it kind of takes the onus off of them for doing it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I see a lot of lawsuits in their future. There's no question about that. So I'm not going to keep you late for class. You know what? I'm going to leave you with just one thought. Speaking of all the partition and Peel Commission, all of those things, I'm going to suggest two things. Read The War of Return. It's by Dr. Einat Wilf and Adi Schwartz. It is to reframe the entirety of our past 100 years history here in Israel. And as far as I see, in addition to the work, and Mabruch, may you go from strength to strength, and may you bring many others, inspire them to action. But I say, be more Jewish. This is already and I don't mean do it the way I do it. I mean, this is ours. This is learn what has kept us a clear and cohesive people throughout thousands of years. Increase your knowledge of our shared history and our shared traditions, and without fear of their obligation. This is what's kept us. This is who we are. This is who we've always been. There's a continuity of our peoplehood from time, from thousands of years until today. Let's have you on again, Eyal, when you get further on in your lawsuit and your studies, and we see what's happening next on campuses. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Okay, be well.